Okay, good evening, everyone. So tonight's talk is entitled Race, Ethnicity, Racism and Migration. And once again, I'm going to try and squeeze a lot into an hour. I think I need to start by saying that race, in inverted commas, is a socially constructed classification based on perceived physical characteristics like skin color or hair texture and facial features. It's important to emphasize that it is not scientifically valid as a biological category because genetic variation within so-called racial groups is greater than between them. However, it is a founding ideology of Western societies and became embedded in 18th and 19th century theories about racial types as a means of maintaining a racial order, which by and large still persists to this day. Now, during that period, the 18th and 19th centuries, botanists, biologists, and zoologists systematically set about classifying every species on the planet, including human beings, and especially after Charles Darwin's publication of Origin of the Species. So, to give you an example, in the 18th century, this Swedish scientist distinguished four races. He later reclassified brown Asian as yellow. Although it was rooted in geographical origin, skin colour was considered to be the key distinguishing feature. However, without any evidence at all, Linnaeus and others imputed personal and social characteristics to the different racial groups. However, this guy, Arthur de Gobineau, is considered to be the father of modern racism. In his book, The Inequality of the Human Races, which was published in 1855, he argued that there were basically just three different races. In addition, he argued that the white race possessed superior intelligence, superior morality, and superior willpower. These, he argued, were inherited qualities that underpinned the spread of Western influence. The black race, he argued, was the least capable, marked by an animal nature, a lack of morality, and emotional instability. Now, these kind of wild generalizations are clearly regarded as non-scientific nonsense today, but they have clearly been influential in things spawning things like Nazism in Germany, the Ku Klux Klan in America, the National Front, and a succession of other racist parties in Britain, as well as infecting the social sciences. I don't suppose some of you might know who the fellow is down in the bottom right. If you don't know, his name is Hans Eysenck. And he was a very influential psychologist in the 1960s and 1970s who argued that genetic and physiological factors were the foundations of personality which determined why black people are less intelligent and more inclined to commit crime. So influential were his theories that they were taught from A level to postgraduate courses in psychology throughout Britain until very recently. I remember teaching on programs that included psychology and sociology. I was teaching sociology, where Eysenk's theories were taught to psychology students, 16, 17-year olds. So, despite scientists showing overwhelming evidence to the contrary, the idea that white people are superior in every way to black people has become so ingrained in Western consciousness that we're still living with its legacy today. So, for example, until the 1970s, the term half caste was widely used to describe people from mixed race backgrounds. And you still occasionally hear it today. I heard it said at my local football club only a few weeks ago, describing a player as half caste. Now, although appearing to just be descriptive, the word caste is derived from the Latin castus, meaning pure. In other words, the word half caste is associated with the idea of a lack of racial purity and the weakening of a superior white race by racial mixing. In this way, mixed race children are stigmatized. So, this worldview provided a racialized way of thinking about human life and cultures, lending early scientific credence to ideas of white supremacy. But biologists and sociologists today regard race as a totally discredited concept. There are no clear-cut races, just a range of physical variations in the human species. Differences in physical type are caused by population inbreeding. The genetic diversity within populations that share visible physical traits is, as I said earlier, just as great as the diversity between those populations. And UNESCO have recognised these scientific findings in its 1978 Declaration on Race and Racial Prejudice with this statement. However, the legacy of the history of racialization is that many people still believe that there are separate races. This has led to the persistence of discrimination on the basis of supposed races. So, as suggested by D.S. Thomas and her husband W.I. Thomas way back in 1928, our subjective interpretation of a situation rather than the objective reality of that situation can have a significant impact on our behaviour and outcomes that follow. In other words, if we define a situation as real, if people think that there are races, we will behave as if they are real, and the consequences of our actions will be shaped by that definition. By the way, in today's parlance, we should now say men and women. In other words, whilst it's nothing more than an ideological construct, the notion of separate races still has real world consequences. And those consequences are more than ways of describing human differences. They're also important factors in the reproduction of patterns of power and inequality. The process through which understandings of race are used to classify individuals or groups of people is called racialization. So everyday social institutions are racialized in a de facto manner. For example, the concept of race is still embedded in standard forms used in healthcare, in job applications, in the census, and many more other forms that we might fill in. And this on the screen now is the UK census form. And whilst it says, "What is your ethnic group?" it is actually asking about race rather than ethnicity. So if you look at question B, for example, white and black Caribbean, white and black African, white and Asian, and so on. Um, uh, I'll explain the difference between race and ethnicity in a minute, though, although I guess that most of you already know. Some categories here in the census seem to be loosely based on skin colour, some on geographical regions, and some on nationality. This is quite important because these categories form the basis for policy making in areas like housing, welfare, healthcare, education, legal representation, immigration, and employment. So, race remains a vital, if highly contested, concept that affects individuals' daily lives. The Office for National Statistics classification system therefore reflects not just certain characteristics of the population of England and Wales, but also the current political framework of debate on immigration and British identity. So it's important to acknowledge the limitations of these categories to capture the reality of people's experience. And that reality is the problem of groupism, putting people into groups. So, what is ethnicity? Ethnicity refers to a source of identity whose basis lies in society and culture. There's nothing innate about ethnicity, unlike the idea of race that implies something fixed and biological. Ethnicity refers to a type of social identity related to ancestry and cultural differences, whether these are perceived or very real ones. They are imagined communities. Like nations, in the sense that their existence depends on self identification. Members of ethnic groups may see themselves as culturally distinct from other groups and are seen by them as different. Several characteristics may serve to distinguish ethnic groups. Most usual ones are things like language, a sense of shared history or ancestry, religion, styles of dress, and so on. So this may seem obvious, but ethnic differences are learned. It may seem like an obvious point until we remember that often some groups are ascribed characteristics such as naturally lazy. Ethnicity can provide an important thread of continuity with the past and is often kept alive through the practices of cultural traditions. These kind of global diasporas are becoming more common, sometimes in a forced manner, as with Jewish and African diasporas as a result of genocide or slavery in the cases of Jewish and African diasporas, but increasingly because of voluntary movements. So, for example, as you can see from this slide, third generation Americans of Irish descent may proudly identify themselves as Irish American and celebrate St. Patrick's Day despite having lived their entire lives in the United States. I've been in Chicago on St. Patrick's Day when hundreds of thousands celebrate their heritage by dressing up, having a parade, and putting dye in the rivers and canals to turn them green, as you can see here. It's just a fantastic sight, it really is. In the age of globalization and rapid social change, international migration is accelerating. The movement and mixing of human populations seems certain to intensify in the future. Like many other countries, Britain today is an ethnically diverse society. 16% of British population is now from a minority ethnic background. London is easily the most ethnically diverse region of England. I think that it's important to note that immigration is now responsible for a declining proportion of minority ethnic populations in Britain. And I think this is key to understanding multiculturalism, to ensure that minority ethnic groups can enjoy the full benefits of citizenship. But how can ethnic diversity be accommodated and the possibility of ethnic conflict averted? Well, there are three. I mean, I'm sure you're aware of the kinds of things that Enoch Powell said back in the 70s about, there's going to be rivers of blood flowing through British streets if we carried on with large-scale immigration into Britain. To avoid that, there are three primary models of ethnic integration that's been adopted by multi-ethnic societies. The first is the policy of assimilation, and that suggests that immigrants should abandon their original customs and practices and mould their behaviour to the values and norms of the majority. And this might mean demanding that immigrants change their language, change their dress, their lifestyles and cultural outlooks as part of integrating into a new social order. The second model of ethnic integration is called the melting pot. And this is that cultures become blended to form new evolving cultural patterns. To some extent, this has happened in Britain. To take a rather trite example, the dish chicken tikka masala was invented by Pakistani chefs in Indian restaurants and is now Britain's favourite meal. In 2001, the Foreign Secretary Robin Cook described it as now a true British national dish, not only because it is the most popular, but because it is a perfect illustration of the way Britain absorbs and adapts external influences. Chicken tikka is an Indian dish. The masala sauce was added to satisfy the desire of British people to have their meat served in gravy. Many people think that the melting pot model is the most desirable form of ethnic integration. I mentioned Chicago just now, it's what's happened in Chicago, really. Um, Traditions and customs of immigrant populations are not abandoned, but contribute to and shape a constantly transforming society. So we get hybrid forms of cuisine, of fashion, of music, of architecture. These are all manifestations of the melting pot approach. And then the third major model of ethnic integration is cultural pluralism, which is otherwise known as multiculturalism. This is where different ethnic cultures are given full validity to exist separately, yet participate in the larger society's economic and political life. For example, when me and my wife lived in Leeds for 7 years, every year we used to go to the Beeston Mellah, which is a Mellah is a festival, an Asian festival, and this was a festival in the predominantly Asian part of South Leeds, where there was dancing, music, food, and much, much more celebrating Asian cultures. And we were made to feel very welcome. The local MP used to go as well. So that's an example of multiculturalism. So, with regard to cultural pluralism or multiculturalism, if you prefer that term, in his 2000 book, Rethinking Multiculturalism, Bhikkhu Parekh talks about the need to find ways of reconciling the legitimate demands of unity and diversity, of achieving political unity without cultural uniformity, and cultivating among its citizens both a common sense of belonging and a willingness to respect and cherish deep cultural differences. So, in reality, apart from the little Englanders who scream, "We want our country back," I think most of us see ourselves as belonging to a variety of identity groups and have little problem with that. The same person can be, without any contradiction, see themselves as British, of Caribbean origin, with an African ancestry, or as an atheist, a socialist, a woman, a vegetarian, a historian, a novelist, a feminist, a heterosexual, a believer in gay rights, an environmental activist, or in my case, a football fan. So we can see ourselves as many different things, and we don't have a problem with that. But critics of multiculturalism are concerned about the potential for ethnic segregation and conflict. So, for example, separate schools for Protestants and Catholics in Northern Ireland. I don't believe in separate schools for anybody of any religious belief. I think we should all go to the same kind of schools. However, multiculturalism should not be about separatism. This is naive to describe multiculturalism as about separatism. Equality of status does not mean the uncritical acceptance of all cultural practices. So, whilst all groups of people in a society have an equal right to respect, they also have responsibilities, including the responsibility to obey the law. So, for example, um, you know, there are some from African cultures who still engage in FGM, female genital mutilation, which I don't think they should be. So it doesn't mean to say that I haven't got differences with some cultural practices. Now, the term ethnic is using the term ethnic problematic. The term ethnic is commonly used by the right-wing media and the wider white British public to refer to alien, in inverted commas, cultural practices. Now, whilst I prefer the concept of ethnicity over race because it doesn't carry any biological reference, it does imply a contrast with some kind of non-ethnic norm or cultural practices that differ from so-called indigenous or non-ethnic British practices. So the term ethnic is often applied by right-wingers to neighbourhoods and practices that are said to be non-British. And that can be from food to clothing to music and so on. We've all heard people refer to ethnics, usually in a derogatory way. Using ethnic labels in this way risks producing divisions between us and them, where certain sections of the population are regarded as ethnic, whilst others are not, resulting in more powerful groups perceiving themselves as the natural, as the norm from which all other ethnic groups diverge. It's not just certain segments of it, but you wouldn't think so reading the Daily Mail, who use the word ethnics. So, what are minority ethnic groups? Sometimes they're called ethnic minorities or BAME groups. BAME stands for Black and Minority Ethnic. It refers to groups that are disadvantaged in some way compared to dominant groups. So, dominant groups who may have more wealth, more power, more prestige, and have some sense of group solidarity or belonging together. Now, researchers frequently use the term minority in a non-literal way. In other words, the term minority ethnic groups isn't necessarily used to signify a numerical disadvantage, but to refer to a group who are in a subordinate position and are subject to prejudice and discrimination that tends to heighten feelings of common loyalty and interests. So, Newham in London, for example, which is where I go every other Saturday to watch West Ham play, has a minority ethnic population of 70%, the largest of any of the London boroughs. So they're not a minority in the literal sense. So you have to be careful about speaking of minorities per se. Speaking collectively of minorities can result in generalizations about discrimination and oppression that don't necessarily accurately reflect the experiences of specific groups. So, what about prejudice and discrimination? Well, prejudice refers to negative opinions or attitudes held by members of one group towards another. A prejudiced person's preconceived views are often based on hearsay rather than on direct evidence, and they're usually very resistant to change, even in the face of new information that contradicts their prejudice. So, prejudices are frequently grounded in stereotypes, fixed and inflexible characterizations of a social group. Some of them might contain a grain of truth, but they become embedded in cultural understandings and are difficult to erode, even when they are gross distortions of reality. Have you ever tried having a conversation, as I'm sure many of you have, with a reform voter on Facebook on what asylum seekers are like in general? You know, you're banging your head against a brick wall often. Scapegoating is common when economic groups come into competition with one another for economic resources. People who direct racial attacks against ethnic minorities, for example, are often in a similar economic and social position of powerlessness. Polls have consistently shown that people who feel hard done by often blame ethnic minorities, when the blame obviously lies elsewhere, usually with powerful or wealthy groups. But those powerful or wealthy groups encourage powerless groups to blame others who are similarly affected. And this isn't just left-wing people saying this. Polls conducted by such diverse organisations as Stonewall and The Economist, you couldn't get more diverse than those two, have found this to be the case. Discrimination is actual behaviour towards a group or individual. This can include everything from poor housing provision, a lack of adequate educational provision for Romani children, for example, to racist violence and crime. Racism is more than simply the ideas held by bigoted individuals. And this brings me on to discuss institutional racism. This is from the Macpherson report, which I'll just come to in a moment. It suggests that racism pervades all of society's structures in a systematic way. For example, the police, the health service, the education system all promote policies that favour certain groups whilst discriminating against others. I'm going to use a case study to illustrate what institutional racism looks like in practice. You can see that this definition is taken from the Macpherson inquiry. So, what was the Macpherson inquiry? It was a public inquiry initiated in 1997 by the Home Secretary Jack Straw into the racist murder of black teenager and A-level student Stephen Lawrence by 5 white youths while he was waiting at a bus stop with a friend in southeast London in 1993. The attackers stabbed him twice and left him to die on the pavement. The inquiry found that police arriving on the scene made no effort to pursue the attackers and made the erroneous assumption that Stephen had been involved in a street brawl rather than being an innocent victim of an unprovoked racist attack. They were slow to call an ambulance while Stephen lay dying on the ground. The police showed a total lack of respect for Stephen's parents. They called his father Neville to the police station where they questioned him all night long about Stephen before then telling him his son was dead. Surveillance of the suspects was poorly organised and conducted with a lack of urgency. Searches of the suspects' homes were not performed thoroughly, despite the police receiving tips where weapons might be concealed. During the course of the investigation and subsequent inquiries into it, police withheld vital information, protected one another, and refused to take responsibility. At the time, nobody was convicted of murder. When Stephen's parents, Doreen and Neville, launched a campaign to bring the perpetrators to justice, rather than supporting them, the Metropolitan Police spied on the Lawrence family using undercover officers and secret cameras in their house. The extent of this spying is currently being investigated 30 years later by the Mitting inquiry into undercover policing. Doreen Lawrence has more than once walked out of the inquiry because the police keep covering things up with the usual reply, "We can neither confirm nor deny that" response. It was only because of Stephen's parents' perseverance that in 1996, three of the suspects were brought to trial, but the case collapsed. So in 1997, even the Daily Mail, not known for its sympathy to black oppression, published pictures of the five murderers on their front page with an invitation for the racist youths to sue the Mail if they were being wrongly accused. Needless to say, they didn't sue the Daily Mail. What was the reason why the Mail took up the case? The usually racist editor Paul Dacre, when asked, said decent chap, as if, being black, he wouldn't expect him to be. The charge of institutional racism was the most damning, not just for the police, but for the whole criminal justice system. 70 recommendations were made, everything from improving the way racist crimes are investigated to race awareness training, stronger measures to remove racist officers, and a commitment to recruit more Black and Asian officers. However, for some, including Doreen Lawrence, the report didn't go far enough. She said that the police had investigated her son's murder like white masters during slavery, and that the report had only scratched the surface of racism in the police. It wasn't until 2011, 18 years after Stephen Lawrence died, that two of the five racists were found guilty of murder and jailed. So, as far as the criminal justice system is concerned, we've just seen an example of how racism is institutionalized in the criminal justice system. But it goes much deeper than just one isolated case, important though it was. Black and minority ethnic groups are overrepresented in the criminal justice system as offenders, as victims, and in the prison population. 39% of the population of youth jails in England and Wales are from black and minority ethnic groups. One reason is that black and minority ethnic groups are much more likely to be subject to stop and search. Research by Walker in 2019 showed that ethnic disproportionality in stop and search cannot be explained away by other factors. There's also a higher rate of custodial sentencing amongst non-white people when it's the same offence. Ethnic minorities are more likely to experience discrimination or racial attacks once they're imprisoned. So the administration of the criminal justice system is overwhelmingly dominated by white people, from police officers to court judges. However, it's not just the criminal justice system where there is institutional racism. In employment, despite several laws outlawing discrimination since the 1960s, research has consistently shown that companies consistently offer interviews and job opportunities to white applicants in preference to equally qualified non-white applicants. So, one research study by Stasio and Heath in 2019, just 7 years ago, sent out 3,200 fictitious job applications covering a range of ethnic groups, all with the same skills, qualifications, and experiences. 25% of white applicants got a positive response, such as a callback, but only 15% of black and minority ethnic applicants did. The worst discrimination was for those with Pakistani and Nigerian backgrounds. I've got a friend who comes from a Pakistani background. His surname is Haji. His name's Armin Haji. And he's told me that when he runs his own business now, but when he used to apply for jobs, he's got a degree in psychology. He just kept getting turned down. And the most frustrating thing he said for him was never knowing whether it was because of his name, because of his ethnicity. That was the most frustrating thing. And he got turned down for hundreds of jobs. Um, so also, the median net income for white British men is 30% higher than for black and for black British Caribbean men. Then there's unemployment. Unemployment remains relatively high for black African, black Caribbean, and other groups of black men. Um, on housing, differentials in ownership, quality, and type of housing vary across ethnic groups. So, for example, in 2018, 68% of white British households were home owners, compared to just 20% for black Africans. However, the highest level of home ownership of any group was that of Indian households at 74%. Still, most ethnic minority groups are disproportionately housed in rented, substandard accommodation. If anybody saw Claire's talk last week on Frestonia, she talked about South London and the South London community. and the Rachmanism that went on back in the 60s. Well, it still exists today. Um, so there may be a number of factors. Non-white families with the means to move into more affluent, predominantly white neighbourhoods may be put off for fear of hostility. A high proportion of Pakistanis and Bangladeshis live in overcrowded accommodation that's more likely to be damp and lack central heating. In contrast to that, people of Indian origin are just as likely as white people to live in detached or semi-detached houses. So we can't make generalizations between ethnic minorities as a whole and the white British population. African Caribbeans more likely to rent social housing than to become homeowners. In terms of health, I don't want to go into health inequalities in too much depth because it's a huge issue. But I used to teach a module on the sociology of health a number of years ago. But just to say that research in 2020 by Cochrane suggests that substandard housing is a significant factor in higher levels of poor health amongst some minority ethnic groups. However, having said that, health inequalities are more strongly correlated with social class than with race and ethnicity. So, what about theories of racism? Well, um, ethnocentrism is the suspicion of outsiders combined with a tendency to evaluate the culture of others in terms of one's own culture. Outsiders are thought of as aliens, as barbarians, or morally and mentally inferior. And this often goes together with group closure, which refers to the process whereby groups maintain boundaries separating themselves from others. These boundaries are formed by means of exclusion devices which sharpen the divisions between one ethnic group and another. And this can include restrictions. They might be social restrictions or legal restrictions on intermarriage. There's legal restrictions on intermarriage in some societies, restrictions on social contact or with regard to economic relations, um, physical separation of groups, as was the case in apartheid South Africa or the black ghettos of the United States. I mean, if I talked about Chicago earlier, if you go to Chicago, don't go to South. If you're white, don't go to South Chicago because you'll stand out like a sore thumb because it's overwhelmingly black. Um, well, you should go there, but because um, but you might feel really out of place if you do. Um, but group closure often coincides with resource allocation, um, which institutionalizes inequalities in the distribution of wealth and material goods. The concept of ethnic group closure helps us understand both the dramatic and the more insidious differences that separate communities of people from one another. Not just why the members of some groups of people are murdered, attacked, or harassed, as in the case of Stephen Lawrence, but also why they don't get good jobs, a good education, and a nice place to live. Conflict theories are concerned with the links between racism and prejudice on the one hand, and relationships of power and equality on the other. Early conflict theories were heavily influenced by Marxist ideas that regarded the economic system as the determining factor for all other aspects of society. Marxist theorists argued that racism was a product of the capitalist system, arguing that the ruling class used slavery, colonization, and racism as tools for exploiting labour. Later on, neo-Marxist commentators like Stuart Hall and his colleagues at Birmingham University regarded these early formulations as too rigid and simplistic. They suggested that racism wasn't the product of economic forces alone. So, a set of articles which were published in 1982 by the Birmingham Centre for Contemporary Cultural Studies under the leadership of Stuart Hall took a broader, more cultural view of racism in that period in the 1980s. While agreeing that capitalist exploitation of labour, both in the past and during the 1970s economic crisis, were underlying factors, that crisis was also, in their words, organic. By that, they meant that the economic crisis, combined with other elements like the cultural and ideological legacy of colonialism, that was embedded within British institutions as the Thatcherite shift towards a more authoritarian British state apparatus that I talked about in an earlier talk. And this led to a specific form of racism in Britain in the 1970s and 80s. So they argued that racism is not simply the imposition of ruling class ideas on a passive society, nor can it be defined in a static, unchanging way. Racism, they argued, is always a complex, shifting, and multifaceted phenomenon involving the interplay of ideological, economic, political, and cultural factors. But the concept, as I said earlier, of biological race has now been totally discredited. This has led to the total collapse of, for example, segregation in the United States and the apartheid regime in South Africa. So now only extreme far right groups now cling to the myths about biological racism. However, it has been replaced by a new cultural racism. This is a more subtle form of racism that uses the idea of cultural differences to exclude certain minority groups. Hierarchies of superiority and inferiority are constructed according to the values of the majority culture. Those groups that stand apart from the majority can become marginalised or vilified for their imagined or real refusal to assimilate. Islamophobia is an example of this new racism. Muslims have for some time become convenient scapegoats for a range of social problems, from terrorism to sexual grooming to urban unrest to ethnic segregation. So the Runnymede Trust defined Islamophobia as anti-Muslim racism. In their report, the Runnymede Trust suggest that it is important to adopt an open rather than a closed view of Islam. An open view sees Islam as diverse. A closed view of Islam sees it as monolithic, a single entity, separate, inferior, manipulative, and as an enemy, which tends to be based on negative stereotypes. A closed view takes no account of the wide variety of beliefs within Islam and focuses exclusively on its most extreme and threatening forms. Now, other religious groups are not seen in the same way. So, for example, Christian fundamentalists who bomb abortion clinics in the States or attack doctors and threaten them with murder if they perform abortions are not usually seen as being typical of all Christians. Islamophobia isn't just confined to far right marches or extremist political parties like Reform. It operates across a diverse range of contexts, including in institutions, in public spaces, and online. Social media provide a diverse set of platforms for racist and, in particular, Islamophobic opinions and images to be shared with others. Celebrities with large social media followings also play a key role in fostering Islamophobia online. When I wrote this, I was thinking specifically of somebody like Katie Hopkins. Last year, the General Federation of Trade Unions worked with AI modeling and data company Bombay and found that those expressing support for far right views on Muslims get most of their news from sites like Twitter, TikTok, and GB News rather than from traditional media. So, demonization and attacks on Muslims usually spike immediately after atrocities that are committed by Islamic extremists, like the bombing of the World Trade Center in New York in 2001, or the London bombings of 2007, and the murder of three little girls in Southport in 2024. That last case in particular was fueled by a false claim put on social media by a far right activist that the perpetrator was a recently arrived Muslim asylum seeker. But also, Islamophobia takes place at national level, institutional level, and in public spaces. Um, so, at national level, counter-terrorism policy through surveillance in schools, colleges, and universities. I suppose you've all heard of the Prevent program. You may not have, but as a lecturer in further and higher education, I was compelled by law to do the Prevent program. And, some of the things were clearly racist in the Prevent program, but I was compelled to do it or lose my job. At an institutional level, so for example, when a woman is not given a job based on Islamophobic stereotypes, or the exclusion of a Muslim colleague from office lunch gatherings because they're assumed to be difficult and awkward for not wanting to eat certain foods or consume alcohol. Now I was well, not guilty of this, but almost guilty of this myself. When I worked at the University of Bedfordshire, I took a group of students out on a field trip. There was only one student out of about 17, 18 of them that was Muslim. She was a young woman of 18 who wore a hijab. When it came to lunchtime, a lot of the other students said to me, "We're going to the pub. We're all going to the pub, Jack. Do you want to come?" And I said to them, "What about this other student? She might not want to go to the pub." So took her to one side, this other student, said, look, the others are talking about going to the pub. If you don't want to go, I'll go to we'll find a cafe and we'll go to the cafe together. And she said to me, oh no, I'd really like to go to a pub. I've never been to a pub before. She said, I won't drink alcohol, but she said, yeah, she said, that would be really good to see the inside of a pub. And I said, well, I know you're only 18. I said, what would your mum and dad think of you going to a pub? She said, my dad brought me up as a Muslim, but said to me, when you're 18, you can make your mind up about anything. So he wouldn't mind at all. So I made certain assumptions which I shouldn't have done. But, some people um, do make certain assumptions that they shouldn't do. And I was wrong to make those assumptions. But then also in public spaces, which range in public spaces, Islamophobia can manifest itself in subtle forms of exclusion, like awkward looks and glances and stares, through to verbal abuse, intimidation, and physical assault. And women are more liable to suffering this abuse because they're more visible, especially if they wear a hijab. Many incidents are reported on public transport, outside or close to mosques, through damage to property, the distribution of racist literature, and through demonstrations, protests, and marches. A great niece of mine came round to see me last 3 days ago. Actually, I haven't seen her for about 10 years. And she said, I ought to tell you that I've become a Muslim since you last saw me. And I said, oh, that's fine. And she said, she wasn't wearing a hijab when she came round to see me, but she said, the other day I wore a hijab for the first time. And she said, I couldn't believe the amount of abuse I got in Ipswich for wearing a hijab. And she said, I said to people when they were, I heard people saying, go back to where you came from. And she said, I reacted by saying, look, I was born in Britain. I come from Britain. But she said, I couldn't believe how much abuse I got. So anyway, it's just a personal example. Last September, Stephen Yaxley Lennon, also known as Tommy Robinson, organised a march in London billed as a festival of free speech. According to the Metropolitan Police, it attracted between 110 and 150,000 people, making it the largest far-right demonstration in Britain in decades. Speakers talked about great replacement theory. Great replacement theory is a racist, white nationalist conspiracy theory that falsely claims that Western nations are being deliberately replaced by non-white populations through mass immigration, higher birth rates among immigrants, and declining white birth rates. The theory was popularised by a French writer called René Camus in his 2011 book, Le Grand Replacement. Orchestrating this replacement to undermine the European and American cultures. They also talked about banning mosques, temples, and shrines, and also talked about migrants as invaders and Islam as the enemy. Speaking through a video link, Elon Musk called for the dissolution of Parliament and told the crowd, whether you choose violence or not, violence is coming to you. Either you fight back or you die. Last month, on May the 16th, Yaxley Lennon organised a second Unite the Kingdom march, which attracted far fewer people. The police estimate was 60,000, although in typical Trumpian style, the organisers said the real number was over a million, despite the fact that the police had used drones, helicopters, and CCTV footage to calculate the actual crowd size. Now, I don't always believe the police when they say, I've had a lifetime of experience of going on marches and sit, but usually the police um, underestimated by about 50% how many people are there. But, they said 60,000. And Yaxley Lennon is claiming there was over a million people. Um, Now, it might be wrong to conclude that there are 100,000 fascists organised in Britain, just like it would be wrong to conclude that Reform's current popularity in the polls means that nearly 30% of the British population are all fascists. People are drawn towards supporting reform or far right street movements because of the failure of by mainstream politicians to address the economic, social, and political crisis this country is in. The research by Bombay that I mentioned earlier showed that alongside concerns about immigration and the fear of crime, fears about the impact of AI, job insecurity, and housing insecurity were the most significant drivers of support for far right views. Blaming or scapegoating migrants and Muslims for the problems with racist policy and rhetoric deflects attention away from the real causes of these problems, which is the ever increasing gap in wealth and income distribution. Simplistic slogans like "Stop the Boats" ignores the complicated realities of why so many asylum seekers are choosing to put their lives in danger to reach our shores. Depictions of so-called bogus asylum seekers swamping Britain serve to create a distorted image of asylum seekers. But it's not enough to simply condemn this racist and xenophobic rhetoric. We need to respond to those who have seen their standard of living decline dramatically over the last 15 years by rebuilding solidarity in our workplaces and communities. But we also need to constantly put the record straight regarding the facts about asylum seekers. So let's explode some myths. Everyone has the right to seek asylum. Despite right-wing claims to the contrary, it's a universal human right under the 1951 Convention and Protocol relating to the status of refugees. Secondly, asylum seekers are not required to claim asylum in the first safe country they reach. This is a common misconception that I am sure many of us hear frequently. Thirdly, there are no safe legal routes to Britain for the purpose of claiming asylum. To those who claim these are illegals, ask them, ask those people, well, how do you claim asylum in the UK illegally then? Some other facts about asylum seekers. In 2025, 100,625 people applied for asylum in Britain. That's 4% lower than in 2024. The figure for Germany was 163,000, France 152,000, Spain 143,000, and Italy 134,000, all more than Britain. So the idea that they're all coming to Britain to claim benefits is bogus. In fact, the UK rates 15th in Europe in terms of asylum applications per head of population, putting a lie to the claim that they all want to come to Britain because of all the freebies they'll get. 41,000 crossed the channel in small boats in 2025. The top five nationalities for small boat arrivals in 2025 were Eritrea, Afghanistan, Iraq, Sudan, and Somalia. All of those countries are suffering horrific conflict, violence, or oppression. The best way to reduce the numbers seeking asylum in Europe is to stop selling arms to or sponsoring and taking part in wars abroad. In 2018 to 24, 68% of applicants arriving by small boats were initially granted protection, and many more were successful on appeal. Also, let's explode some myths about the benefits of seeking asylum in the UK. Asylum seekers get just £9.95 a week if they're in catered accommodation, in other words, those that are being kept in hotels. Could you live on £9.95 a week, taking away your meals? The value of asylum support payments fell by 37% in real terms between the years 2000 and 2024. They get £49.18 per week if they're in dispersal accommodation. So, for example, if they're not in hotels, if they're in shared houses where they have to buy their own food and so on, they get £49 a week. They're not allowed to work in the UK unless they've been waiting for more than 12 months for their case to be heard, and only then if they qualified for for an immigration salary list role. Once their claim for asylum has been granted, they become refugees. While they're asylum seekers, they cannot claim mainstream benefits or access council housing, which you often hear. One of the things, oh, they all get council houses. They can't apply for council houses. What is the UK refugee situation once they get refugee status? Refugees can work, claim mainstream benefits, and apply for social housing. It's important to note that they are subject to the same criteria as other people. So, despite right-wing claims to the contrary, they do not get preferential treatment, for example, on council house waiting lists. Refugee status is temporary and subject to review every 30 months. And there is a baseline waiting time of 20 years for permanent settlement. 60,000 refugees were resettled in the UK in 2025, 92% of them under Afghan schemes, which was a fall. Despite all the Afghan resettlement, this was a fall of 19% from 2024. Now, what does this represent, this 6,000? It represents 0.01% of the world's refugees. In other words, 1 in 10,000. Refugee family reunion in Britain is currently suspended. This means that children are separated from their parents indefinitely with no prospect of being reunited. Anyone who arrives via a dangerous journey will normally be refused UK citizenship forever. This is due to the 2025 changes to the Labour government's good character guidance. So, what about us locally? I know not everybody in here lives in Suffolk, but most of you do. Um, there's about 200 asylum seekers in dispersal accommodation in Suffolk. About half of these are in Ipswich. There are currently no asylum contingency accommodation in Suffolk, in other words, no hotels. There are about 300 unaccompanied asylum seeking children and care leavers in Suffolk. These have been predominantly Afghans and Syrians, and almost all of them are in family groups. About 375 refugees have arrived in Suffolk under resettlement schemes in the past decade. And the largest community of several thousands of settled refugees in Suffolk are Kurdish, and many of them have British citizenship. I'm kind of running well over again, of course, but if you're interested in migratory patterns, then this book, which is now in its sixth edition by Castles and Miller, is a very good book to read. It's about, it describes and explains contemporary international migration, analyzes how immigrant settlement drives ethnic diversity, and examines the complex interactions between migration and social, cultural, and political developments. I won't go into all of this, but what are the consequences of the age of migration? Well, there's a number of consequences. One in 30, every 33 people in the world today is a migrant. About 250 million people live in a country other than where they were born. And the International Organization for Migration estimate that this number may double by 2060. And these migratory patterns have led to what has been described as super diversity in many countries like Britain. For example, Hackney in the East End, a borough that I'm very familiar with because I often park in Hackney, and I have friends who live in Hackney, is recognised as one of the most diverse boroughs in London. I won't go through all the statistics, but um, the fact is that the borough's diversity is characterised by strong community cohesion, with 90% of residents in a 2016 survey stating that people from different backgrounds in Hackney get on very well together. So this suggests that the greater the diversity, the more that multiculturalism works. So I was going to look into the history of immigration into United Kingdom. I won't go into this in too much detail, but long before the Industrial Revolution, there were Jewish and Black and Irish communities lived in Britain. Millions of immigrants came from Ireland in the 19th century because of the potato famine. Large wave of immigration into Britain happened in the 30s due to Nazi persecution, and 70,000 more came during the Second World War. And then something that the last thing I want to deal with is the Windrush generation. You may know all about the um, Windrush generation that came to Britain in after the Second World War um, to fill the jobs that we couldn't get people to do. They were actually invited over to Britain from the West Indies to come and fill those jobs. And they're called the Windrush generation because the first wave of them came on a converted warship called the Empire Windrush. And it docked at Tilbury. And in February of this year, I went on a cruise from Tilbury, and there's a big tapestry in the docks there that was done by the Windrush generation. It's if you ever go from Tilbury, go and have a look at the tapestry. But anyway, the Windrush generation of mainly those from the West Indies were followed in the 70s by Asians who arrived. This is Asians arriving at Stansted. Um, During this whole period, there was a backlash against immigrants from the white working class living in poorer areas. There were the Notting Hill race riots, which I think you referred to, Claire, in your talk last week. But the Notting Hill race riots led to the establishment of the Notting Hill Carnival, um, but it also led to the race riots also led to the enactment of the Commonwealth Immigrants Act in 1962, but also since then a whole raft of legislation gradually restricting entry and settlement rights to non-whites while protecting the ability of whites from places like Canada and Australia to enter Britain relatively freely. I won't go into all the various acts. Um, After the decision of the Brexit referendum to leave the EU in 2016, when net migration from EU countries fell sharply, the increased hostility to immigrants led to the Windrush scandal. When the Windrush generation came to Britain, at that time in the 40s and 50s and 60s and early 70s, you didn't need any documentary evidence to come here. You were considered a British citizen. But in 2018, many older people from Commonwealth countries received letters from the Home Office saying they wanted them to prove their right to be here. And if not, they would be deported. So people who had lived and worked according to their status as British citizens, 40 years later, there were these letters demanding that unless they could prove they had been continuously resident in the Britain since 1973, they were under threat of removal of their rights to medical care and could also be deported. And this was because at the time they came here, they didn't need any specific documentation to prove their citizenship rights. This was what Theresa May, the Prime Minister, called creating a hostile environment that scapegoated all immigrants. They even had vans with slogans on the side, you may remember this, going round areas of high immigration, warning people to get out of Britain. It led directly to legally settled British citizens being placed under suspicion and being very scared. The consequences were for individuals can be illustrated by one particular case. And this is what I want to finish with to show you where racism leads. Paulette Wilson was a 61-year-old who came to Britain in 1968 when she was 10 and she has never left. Because she never applied for a British passport and had no papers proving she had a right to be in Britain, she was classified as an illegal immigrant. She was sent to the Immigration Removal Centre at Yarlswood in Bedford for a week. She was then taken to Heathrow Airport before being threatened with being deported to Jamaica, a country she had not visited for 50 years and where she had no surviving relatives. Yet she was a former cook where she had served food to MPs at the House of Commons. She had 34 years of national insurance contributions. She was horrified at the prospect of being separated from her daughter and granddaughter. It was only because of an intervention by her MP and a local charity that the decision was reversed. She was then given a biometric card proving she is in Britain legally, but she was told that she had to reapply every 5 years, a prospect that she said terrified her. She received no apology from the Home Office. The government promised they would compensate victims who had lost their jobs and earnings or had been forced into debt. To date, only 1 in 8 victims have been compensated, and much of that compensation has been inadequate. So, finally, to say what this example demonstrates is that increasing mobilities in the contemporary world not only generate public hostilities, but also generate resistance, which is us, basically. An increasingly mobile world gives rise not only to fears of the loss of ethnic and national identity, but it also gives an optimistic notion of a global or cosmopolitan citizenship. And how these opposing views will play out has become less rather than more clear over recent years. I hope I haven't gone on too long, but thank you very much for your patience. I hope you enjoyed it.